The stars shimmered and twisted as the massive fleet emerged from the darkness of hyperspace. Hundreds of ships materialized at the edge of Earth's solar system, their hulls gleaming with the pride of an empire that had never known defeat. The Zirathi Collective had arrived, and they brought with them the weight of conquest that had crushed 23 different civilizations before this moment. Commander Thexlar stood on the bridge of the flagship, his four eyes scanning the primitive solar system before him. The third planet from the star glowed blue and green, covered in water and life. His mandibles clicked together in what passed for a smile among his species. This would be easy. The scans showed a single populated world, no interstellar colonies, and technology that barely qualified as spacefaring. These humans had not even established a permanent presence on their own moon. The communications officer turned toward him, waiting for orders. Thexlar nodded, and the standard message was broadcast across all frequencies. It was the same message the Zirathi had sent to 47 worlds before Earth. Surrender within one rotation of your planet, or face complete annihilation. Submit to the collective and your species would be allowed to serve. Resist and your world would be stripped of resources while your people watched from chains. On Earth, the message arrived simultaneously at every communications hub, radio telescope, and satellite receiver. Within minutes, emergency meetings convened in capitals across the globe. Presidents, prime ministers, and generals gathered in secure rooms, listening to the alien ultimatum repeated in dozens of languages. The translation was perfect, cold, and absolute. The Secretary General of the United Nations stood before the assembly, his face pale but determined. They had one day to respond, one day to decide the fate of humanity. The debate lasted hours. Some argued for surrender, believing that survival was more important than pride. Others demanded resistance, refusing to become slaves to an alien empire. The scientist urged caution, explaining that any species capable of crossing interstellar space possessed weapons beyond human comprehension. In the end, humanity chose defiance. The response was crafted carefully, transmitted toward the alien fleet in every language Earth possessed. Humanity rejected the ultimatum. Earth would not surrender. If the Zirathi wanted this world, they would have to take it by force. Aboard the flagship, Thexlar listened to the human response and his mandibles clicked again, this time in genuine amusement. The translation algorithms worked quickly, and soon the entire bridge crew was sharing in what could only be described as laughter. The sounds echoed through the ship, a chorus of clicking, hissing, and trilling that signified mirth across a dozen different Zirathi subspecies. The tactical officer brought up images of Earth's military capabilities, primitive rockets that could barely reach their own moon, weapons that relied on chemical explosions and metal projectiles, ships that moved through water instead of space. The most advanced human aircraft could not even break free of their own atmosphere without massive fuel reserves. It was pathetic. Thexlar ordered his analysts to study human history, to understand what kind of resistance they might face. The reports came back within hours and they only reinforced his confidence. Humans fought with sticks and stones just 10,000 years ago. Their most devastating weapons were crude atomic devices that they had only possessed for less than a century. Their wars were small, localized affairs fought over patches of dirt and invisible lines called borders. The Zirathi had been waging interstellar war for 3,000 years. They possessed energy shields that could deflect weapons powerful enough to crack moons. Their ships moved faster than light, powered by captured stars. Their smallest fighters carried more firepower than Earth's entire nuclear arsenal. This was not going to be a war. It was going to be an extermination. But there was something in the human historical records that the Zirathi analysts glossed over. Something they did not understand. Humans had been fighting each other since before recorded history. Every continent, every island, every scrap of habitable land had been a battlefield at some point. Humans had developed thousands of different ways to kill each other. They had weaponized disease, fire, water, air, and Earth itself. They had created bombs that could erase cities in seconds. And they had actually used them. In a bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, Admiral Sarah Chen stood before a wall of screens showing defensive positions across the solar system. She was 53 years old, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many war games and simulations. Around her, officers from every nation worked together, their uniforms and flags forgotten in the face of extinction. The Secretary of Defense appeared on one of the screens, his voice tight with stress. The president wanted to know if they had any chance at all. Could Earth's defenses hold against an interstellar empire? Admiral Chen looked at the tactical displays, at the thousands of satellites and hidden platforms that filled Earth's orbit, at the weapon systems that had been built for a nuclear war that never came. She thought about the last century of human innovation, all of it driven by fear and paranoia. The Cold War had ended, but the weapons had never been dismantled. Instead, they had been improved, refined, and multiplied. Every nation with the resources had built their own doomsday arsenals. Humanity had lived under the shadow of mutual destruction for so long that it had become normal. The Admiral took a deep breath and gave her assessment. They could not win a traditional battle. The alien technology was too advanced. But humans had never been good at traditional battles anyway. Humanity's entire military history was filled with guerrilla warfare, ambushes, traps, and desperate last stands that somehow turned into victories. If the aliens expected a fair fight, they were going to be disappointed. She authorized the activation of defensive protocols that had been designed to fight World War III. Thousands of satellites that appeared to be defunct suddenly came online. Mining operations in the asteroid belt received coded transmissions and began redirecting their equipment toward military purposes. Submarine crews received sealed orders and began moving toward predetermined positions. Every nation opened their strategic reserves and began the largest military mobilization in human history. The Zirathi fleet began its advance toward Earth, moving with the confidence of predators who had never encountered anything that could hurt them. Their formation was perfect. Their shields were active and their weapons were charging. Commander Thexler watched Earth grow larger on his displays and felt satisfaction. This primitive species had chosen death over servitude. So be it. In the command bunker, Admiral Chen watched the alien fleet approaching. The other officers looked nervous, scared, and uncertain. But she felt something else entirely. She felt the weight of 10,000 years of human warfare sitting on her shoulders. Every battle, every siege, every desperate stand where humans had clawed survival from the jaws of defeat. She turned to her communications officer and spoke words that would be recorded in every history book written afterward. Her voice was calm, almost casual, as if she was commenting on the weather rather than the end of the world. Send a message to all units. Tell them the aliens think we're primitives. They think we're weak because we never left our solar system. They don't understand that we stayed here because we were too busy trying to kill each other. She paused, and a cold smile crossed her face. Let's show them what evolution in a gravity well full of predators really looks like. Activate all defensive platforms. Release the swarms. And may God have mercy on their souls because we sure as hell won't. The officers around her straightened, fear replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The orders went out across every channel, and Earth prepared to teach the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. The Zirathi fleet maintained their perfect formation as they crossed into the orbit of Mars. Commander Thexler studied his tactical displays with satisfaction. The humans had gone silent after their defiant message, which meant they were probably preparing for surrender. Most primitive species did this. They made brave declarations, then realized the futility of resistance when the war fleet actually arrived. His sensor officer reported something odd. There were thousands of small objects in orbit around Earth, far more than their initial scans had detected. Thexler dismissed it as space debris and civilian satellites, nothing that could threaten ships protected by energy shields designed to withstand asteroid impacts and weapons fire from capital ships. The fleet crossed the orbit of Earth's moon, and that was when everything changed. The space around Earth erupted with movement. What the Zirathi had catalogued as defunct satellites suddenly came alive with energy signatures. But these were not communication satellites or weather monitors. They were weapons platforms, and they had been waiting in silent running mode for exactly this moment. Thousands of them activated simultaneously, their targeting systems locking onto the Zirathi fleet. Before Thexler could even give an order, the first wave hit them, but it was not what he expected. There were no massive energy beams or nuclear missiles fired from large warships. Instead, the platforms released millions of small objects, each no larger than a human vehicle. They moved fast, propelled by chemical rockets and ion drives, spreading out in patterns that seemed random, but were actually calculated to be unpredictable. The Zirathi point defense systems opened fire, designed to intercept missiles and torpedoes. They destroyed hundreds of the small objects. But there were not hundreds. There were millions. For every drone that was shot down, 10 more kept coming. They moved in swarms, splitting and reforming, following no predictable pattern. The first drone reached the lead destroyer. It was damaged, trailing fuel and tumbling through space, clearly dying. The Zarathi crew ignored it, focusing on the functional threats. That was their mistake. The damaged drone suddenly fired its maneuvering thrusters one last time, correcting its tumble and aiming directly at the destroyer's sensor array. It struck at 17,000 meters per second. The explosion was small compared to the size of the destroyer, but it did not need to be large. The sensor array was a delicate instrument, designed for precision rather than durability. It shattered, sending fragments through the surrounding equipment. The destroyer was suddenly blind, unable to track incoming threats or coordinate with the rest of the fleet. 3 more drones, seeing the vulnerable target, changed course and slammed into the same ship. One carried a nuclear warhead. The explosion was small by naval standards, barely 20 kilotons, but it happened inside the destroyer's shield perimeter. The shield was designed to stop external threats, not internal ones. The destroyer's hull cracked, atmosphere venting into space, and the ship began to spin out of control. Thexelar watched in disbelief as his fleet was swarmed. The energy shields were useless. They were calibrated for large objects moving at combat speeds. These drones were too small and too numerous. Some carried nuclear weapons. Others were just kinetic kill vehicles, masses of metal moving at incredible speeds. Still others released clouds of smaller projectiles, creating fields of shrapnel that forced Zarathi ships to maneuver or risk damage to their sensors and weapons. The tactical display showed chaos. Ships were breaking formation, trying to avoid the swarms, but that only made them easier targets. The drones used simple AI and operated independently, requiring no coordination or command structure. Destroying one did nothing to affect the others. It was like trying to fight a cloud of locusts with a rifle. A cruiser exploded as dozens of nuclear-armed drones overwhelmed its point defenses. Another ship lost its main engines when a kinetic drone punched through its armor at a weak point. A third vessel collided with one of its own support ships while trying to evade, both ships damaged badly enough to retreat. Then the railguns opened fire. The moon, which scans had shown to be a barren rock with a few small research stations, suddenly revealed its true purpose. Hidden beneath the gray dust were massive electromagnetic accelerators, built into the lunar rock itself. They fired solid metal projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. No explosives, no warheads, just mass and velocity. The projectiles arrived with almost no warning. Sensors detected them less than a second before impact. Not enough time to maneuver or raise additional shielding. A frigate simply ceased to exist, torn apart by a projectile moving so fast that the armor and hull might as well have been paper. The pieces scattered across thousands of kilometers, glowing red from the heat of impact. Thexelar's flagship rocked as a railgun projectile grazed its shield. The energy barrier flared bright enough to blind sensors, and the strain on the generators was immense. If another shot hit the same section before the shield recharged, they would be crippled or destroyed. He gave the order to retreat, pulling the fleet back beyond the range of the railguns. They needed to regroup, to adapt their tactics. This was not supposed to happen. These primitives should not have weapons like this. The analysts had said Earth was decades away from effective space warfare. As the fleet withdrew, more bad news arrived. The asteroid belt was suddenly hostile. Mining operations that should have been civilian infrastructure were launching projectiles toward the Zarathi fleet. Rocks the size of houses, accelerated by mass drivers that were supposed to be for shipping ore, now became weapons. They would take weeks to arrive, but when they did, they would hit with devastating force. In the command bunker on Earth, Admiral Chen watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction. The first engagement had gone better than expected. The Zarathi had lost 17 ships with dozens more damaged. Earth's losses were minimal. About 40,000 drones destroyed, but they had millions more in reserve. 3 lunar railgun emplacements had been knocked out by return fire, but the others were still operational. The doctrine had worked. Humanity had no massive battleships to match the Zarathi fleet, so they had not built any. Instead, They had embraced the philosophy that had won countless battles throughout history. Overwhelming numbers, acceptable losses, weapons designed to be expendable. Every drone cost less than a fighter jet, and they had been mass-producing them for decades, ever since the first credible reports of potentially hostile alien civilizations. The swarm doctrine had been controversial when it was first proposed. Critics said it was inhumane to build weapons that were designed to be sacrificed. They said it went against military tradition and honor. But Admiral Chen and others like her had studied human history. They knew that survival did not care about honor. Survival cared about winning. A transmission came through from the Zirathi fleet. Commander Thexlar appeared on the screen, his alien features showing what human analysts interpreted as anger and confusion. He demanded to know why humanity was using such barbaric tactics. His species fought with honor, with ships crewed by trained warriors, not mindless machines programmed to die. Admiral Chen felt no sympathy. She had read the reports about the worlds the Zirathi had conquered, the species they had enslaved, the civilizations they had erased. They talked about honor, but only when they were winning. She terminated the transmission without responding. Instead, she authorized the second wave. Another 1,000,000 drones launched from hidden platforms across Earth's orbit. These ones were different. They carried advanced electronic warfare packages designed to hack and disrupt enemy systems. Some carried chemical payloads that would eat through metal and composite materials. Others were designed to latch onto Zirathi ships and broadcast false telemetry, turning friendly fire into a deadly possibility. The analyst reported that the Zirathi were sending messages back to their home territory. They were calling for reinforcements. The transmissions were encrypted, but human quantum computers were working on breaking the codes. What they had already decrypted was interesting. The Zirathi were scared. They had never faced an enemy like this before. Admiral Chen allowed herself a small smile. Humanity had been fighting itself for 10,000 years. They had developed every possible way to kill, to destroy, to win at any cost. The Zirathi had conquered 47 worlds, but those worlds had probably fought fair. They probably tried to match ship for ship, weapon for weapon, honor for honor. Humans did not fight fair. Humans fought to win. And if that meant building millions of expendable weapons, if that meant weaponizing everything from satellites to asteroids, if that meant embracing tactics that others called dishonorable, then so be it. Earth would survive no matter what it cost. The second wave of drones reached the retreating Zirathi fleet, and space lit up with explosions once more. The Zirathi Collective Council gathered in their grand chamber, a space station orbiting their homeworld. The room was designed to accommodate all 17 member species of the collective, with different atmospheric zones and gravity fields for each delegation. High Counselor Vethras, leader of the founding Zirathi species, studied the reports from the human front with growing concern. 3 additional fleets had been dispatched to Earth, the largest military deployment the collective had made in 200 years. 1,200 warships carrying enough firepower to sterilize a dozen planets. Surely this would be enough to crush the human resistance and teach these primitives the price of defiance. But the reports from Commander Thexlar were disturbing. The humans did not fight like any enemy the Zirathi had encountered before. They did not protect their supply lines or defend strategic positions. Instead, they attacked everywhere and nowhere, using weapons that should not exist and tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The reinforcement fleets arrived at Earth's solar system in a show of overwhelming force. Their formation was perfect, their shields overlapping to provide mutual protection, their sensor networks integrated to eliminate blind spots. They had studied human tactics and adapted. This time would be different. The humans hit them before they even reached Mars. Small ships, barely larger than fighters, emerged from the asteroid belt, moving at incredible speeds. They were not military vessels. Transponder signals identified them as civilian transports, mining ships, even cargo haulers. But they had been modified, turned into missile boats carrying payloads that could threaten capital ships. The Zirathi opened fire, destroying dozens of the modified ships. But for every one destroyed, 2 more appeared. And when the civilian ships were destroyed, they exploded with far more force than their size suggested. Human crews had packed them with explosives, turning every vessel into a potential bomb. Some even reached Zirathi ships before being destroyed, ramming into hulls and detonating. Admiral Chen watched the battle from her command bunker, now relocated to an undisclosed location deep underwater. The Zirathi had tried to bomb the original bunker, but the attack had hit a decoy facility filled with equipment designed to emit the same electronic signatures. The real command structure was distributed across dozens of locations, impossible to eliminate with a single strike. The guerrilla campaign was working. Human ships would appear from hiding spots in the asteroid belt, attack Zirathi supply vessels, then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The aliens were learning that space was big, impossibly big, and finding a single ship that did not want to be found was nearly impossible, especially when that ship had no specific base to return to and could sustain itself for months using supplies stolen from the very enemy it was fighting. Then humanity revealed something that made the entire Zirathi Council stand in stunned silence. Human scientists had been working on relativistic weapons, projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, using massive particle accelerators built in the outer solar system. The project had been codenamed Ragnarok, and it had been initialized the moment the Zirathi sent their ultimatum. 36 projectiles were already in motion, traveling through interstellar space toward Zirathi territory. Each one was just a solid mass of metal, weighing several tons, moving at 40% the speed of light. When they arrived, they would hit with more energy than the largest nuclear weapons humanity had ever built. And there was no way to stop them. At that speed, nothing could intercept them. The Zirathi could only watch and wait for the impacts. The psychological warfare began in earnest. Human cyber teams had been analyzing Zirathi computer systems, looking for vulnerabilities. They found them. The alien networks were sophisticated but predictable, designed for efficiency rather than security. Humans had decades of experience fighting cyber warfare against each other, building defenses and attacks that could crack the most protected systems. The hackers did not just steal information, they started broadcasting messages directly into Zirathi ships, bypassing security protocols and displaying information on every screen simultaneously. The messages showed human history, videos of world wars, with millions dead in conflicts that spanned continents, images of nuclear weapons being tested, mushroom clouds rising over deserts and atolls, footage of chemical weapons, biological plagues, and weapons designed specifically to cause maximum suffering. The broadcasts included human philosophy about war, quotes from generals and leaders throughout history, Sun Tzu explaining that all warfare is based on deception, Sherman declaring that war is hell and must be made as terrible as possible, Patton saying that the object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other poor bastard die for his, MacArthur explaining that there is no substitute for victory. And then the broadcasts showed something that truly frightened the Zirathi. They showed humanity's contingency plans for nuclear war, thousands of weapons ready to launch at a moment's notice, protocols for mutually assured destruction, plans that accepted the complete annihilation of human civilization as an acceptable outcome if it meant the enemy would be destroyed as well. One captured human pilot, held prisoner aboard a Zirathi cruiser, was interrogated about these plans. The interrogator wanted to know if humans were truly willing to destroy themselves just to hurt an enemy. The pilot, a woman named Captain Rodriguez with 3 kills to her credit, looked directly at her captor and explained it in simple terms. She told them that humanity had lived under the threat of extinction for over a century. Every major nation had enough nuclear weapons to end civilization. They pointed these weapons at each other and called it peace. Humanity had been one bad decision, one system failure, one miscommunication away from ending their own species dozens of times. And they had lived with that knowledge every single day. The Zirathi did not understand. Their wars were fought for territory and resources. They conquered to expand their empire. The idea of fighting a war where both sides would be destroyed was incomprehensible. What was the point of victory if you did not survive to enjoy it? Captain Rodriguez laughed. She explained that humans had a word for this philosophy: spite, pure spite. If humanity was going to die, they would make damn sure to take their enemies with them. There would be no victory for the Zirathi, only mutual destruction, and humans were perfectly comfortable with that outcome. The interrogator reported this conversation to Commander Thexelar, who forwarded it to the High Council. The report included psychological analysis suggesting that the human was not exaggerating or trying to deceive them. This was genuinely how humans thought about warfare. They were a species that had nearly driven themselves to extinction multiple times and kept fighting anyway. High Counselor, Vethras read the reports and felt something he had not experienced in his 3 centuries of life. He felt fear. Not fear of defeat in battle, but fear of what victory might cost. Even if the Zerathi won, even if they destroyed every human ship and orbital platform, those relativistic projectiles were already in motion. They would arrive in Zerathi territory in a matter of months. 3 worlds would be struck, probably uninhabited colonies, but the message would be clear. A transmission arrived from Earth, directed specifically to the High Council. It came from the collective human governments, signed by representatives from every major nation. The message was simple and direct. Humanity offered peace, withdraw from Earth's solar system, agree to a non-aggression pact, and both species could survive. Continue the war, and humanity would demonstrate exactly what evolution in a gravity well full of predators really meant. The message included a detailed list of the weapons humanity had developed. Kinetic bombardment systems that could glass planets from orbit. Biological weapons designed to target specific DNA sequences. Nanomachine swarms that could disassemble enemy ships at the molecular level. Antimatter warheads produced in particle accelerators. Quantum entanglement bombs that could theoretically destroy targets across interstellar distances. Most of these weapons had never been tested or deployed. Some might not even work as advertised. But the Zerathi had no way to know which ones were real and which ones were bluffs. And humans had already demonstrated weapons that the Zerathi thought were impossible for such a young species to possess. High Counselor Vethras called for a vote. Should they continue the war or accept the human terms? The debate lasted for days. Some argued that retreat would show weakness, that other species might rebel if they saw the collective defeated. Others pointed out that victory was looking increasingly unlikely, and even if achieved, might cost more than the collective could afford. In the end, pride won out. The Zerathi collective had never surrendered before. They would not start now. The order went out to continue the assault on Earth. But this time they would not hold back. They would use their ultimate weapons, the ones reserved for only the most dangerous enemies. If humans wanted total war, they would get it. The Zerathi fleet assembled in formation beyond the orbit of Mars, preparing for what Commander Thexelar promised would be the final assault. They had learned from their mistakes. The new formations were designed to counter swarm tactics. Point defense systems had been upgraded. Shield frequencies had been adjusted to better deflect the smaller human weapons. And most importantly, they had brought the Planet Cracker. The device was ancient, built by the Zerathi thousands of years ago during their expansion wars. It was rarely used because it rendered worlds completely uninhabitable, destroying the very resources the collective sought to acquire. But Earth had proven too difficult to conquer conventionally. The High Council had authorized its use. Better to destroy Earth than to let this dangerous species survive. The Planet Cracker was a massive weapon, larger than most ships in the fleet. It worked by generating a focused gravitational pulse that would penetrate to a planet's core, destabilizing it and causing catastrophic tectonic collapse. The planet would not explode like in fiction, but it would tear itself apart over the course of hours, becoming a molten hellscape where nothing could survive. In the underwater command bunker, alarms shrieked as sensors detected the weapon powering up. Admiral Chen stared at the displays, her face pale but determined. The analysts explained what the device would do. Earth had maybe 6 hours before the weapon reached full charge and fired. After that, nothing could stop it. She looked around the command center at the men and women who had fought so hard to defend their world. They had known this might happen. Every war plan included contingency options for scenarios where conventional defense failed. Now they faced a choice: surrender and hope the Zerathi would show mercy, or use the weapons that had been held in reserve for exactly this moment. Admiral Chen made the call. She authorized the release of every nuclear weapon on Earth. Not at the Zerathi fleet, though some were targeted there. No, most of the weapons had one single target: the Planet Cracker itself. Across the globe, missile silos opened. Submarines surfaced and unlocked their payload bays. Strategic bombers took off from hidden airfields. In total, over 4,000 nuclear weapons launched within a 10-minute window. Every nation contributed what they had: old Cold War stockpiles that were supposed to have been dismantled, modern weapons that had been built in secret, Everything humanity had created for the purpose of destroying itself was now directed at a single alien device. The Zirathi detected the launches immediately. Commander Thexelar ordered the fleet to intercept, but there were too many missiles coming from too many directions. The point defense systems fired continuously, destroying hundreds of warheads. But hundreds more got through. They converged on the planet cracker like moths to a flame. The explosions began. Small at first, as the Vanguard missiles detonated, their electromagnetic pulses disrupting Zirathi sensors and communications. Then the main barrage arrived. Nuclear fireballs bloomed in the vacuum of space, each one releasing more energy than a small star. The planet cracker was heavily armored, designed to withstand incredible punishment. But it was not designed to withstand 4,000 nuclear weapons detonating in sequence. The device's shields overloaded first, flickering and failing under the sustained assault. Then the armor began to fail, sections melting or being blown away by the continuous explosions. The gravitational generators, so close to full charge, became unstable. Feedback loops formed as the delicate equipment was damaged. The planet cracker exploded. Not from the nuclear weapons, but from its own power core failing catastrophically. The explosion was visible from Mars, a second sun that briefly outshone Earth's star. The shockwave radiated outward, catching dozens of Zirathi ships that had been positioned too close. Shields failed, hulls crumpled, and ships tumbled through space, trailing debris and atmosphere. When the sensors cleared and the fleet could see again, the planet cracker was gone. So was nearly 40% of the Zirathi fleet, destroyed either by the nuclear barrage or by the device's explosion. The remaining ships were damaged, disorganized, and their morale was shattered. But Earth had paid a price too. Those 4,000 nuclear weapons had been humanity's ultimate deterrent, the guarantee that no nation could attack another without facing annihilation. Now they were gone, expended in a single desperate gambit. Earth's orbital defenses were running low on drones and ammunition. The railgun installations on the moon had been targeted and damaged. If the Zirathi pressed the attack now, Earth might not be able to stop them. Commander Thexelar stared at the empty space where the planet cracker had been. His species had built that weapon over 1,000 years ago. It had been used to destroy 3 particularly stubborn civilizations that refused to surrender, and now it was gone, destroyed by primitives who should not have had the capability or the courage to make such a desperate move. His tactical officer reported that they still outnumbered the human forces. They could continue the attack. But Thexelar found himself hesitating. He thought about the nuclear barrage, about the humans who had launched every weapon they possessed at a single target. They had left themselves defenseless, betting everything on one strike. What kind of species did that? A message came through from High Counselor Vethras. The Council had been watching the battle. They had seen the planet cracker destroyed. They had counted the losses. And they had made a decision. The war would end. Not because the Zirathi could not win, but because victory would cost more than Earth was worth. Thexelar felt relief wash over him. He would not have to order his remaining ships into another meat grinder. He would not have to watch more of his people die fighting an enemy that refused to accept their own defeat. But as he prepared to order the retreat, one final act of human defiance changed everything. A damaged human cruiser, one of the few capital ships Earth had built, drifted toward the Zirathi formation. It had been crippled in an earlier engagement, its engines destroyed and its crew presumably dead. The Zirathi ignored it, focusing on more immediate threats. That was their mistake. The cruiser suddenly came alive. Its remaining maneuvering thrusters fired, correcting its course. It was not drifting randomly. It was on an intercept course with Thexelar's flagship. The crew had not abandoned ship. They had been waiting, pretending to be dead, for exactly this opportunity. Thexelar ordered evasive maneuvers, but flagships were not built for agility. The human cruiser was smaller and more maneuverable even in its damaged state. It closed the distance rapidly, and Thexelar realized with horror what was about to happen. The humans were going to ram them. The cruiser struck the flagship's port side at high velocity. Both ships shuddered from the impact. Alarms blared as hull breaches were reported across multiple decks. But worse was to come. The human cruiser detonated its remaining reactor, deliberately causing a meltdown. The explosion was not large enough to destroy the flagship completely, but it did not need to be. The radiation pulse fried every unshielded electronic system in the area. The flagship went dark, life support failing, and began to tumble. Thexler found himself floating in zero gravity as the emergency lights flickered on. His crew scrambled to restore power and seal the hull breaches. It would take hours to get the flagship operational again. Around him, his officers worked frantically to save the ship. In those desperate moments, Commander Thexlar finally understood what they were facing. Humans did not just fight to win. They fought with a creativity and determination that bordered on insanity. They turned civilian ships into weapons. They weaponized their own self-destruction. They sacrificed their most powerful deterrent to destroy a single enemy asset. And they did it all without hesitation, without mercy, and without any regard for traditional military honor. A rescue ship arrived to evacuate the flagship's crew. As Thexlar was pulled through the airlock, he looked back at his crippled vessel. It had survived hundreds of battles across dozens of star systems, and it had been crippled by a human crew that was probably already dead when they made their final attack. The order came through on the rescue ship's communication system. The Zirathi fleet would withdraw. The High Council was ready to negotiate peace. Earth had won its war for survival. Admiral Chen received the message in her command bunker. The Zirathi were withdrawing. Humanity had survived. Around her, officers and staff began to cheer, but she remained silent. She thought about the cost. The thousands of lives lost in the fighting. The nuclear weapons expended. The ships destroyed. The crew of that final cruiser, who had given their lives for one last strike at the enemy. Humanity had won. But at what price? And more importantly, what would come next? The peace negotiations took place on a neutral station, built hastily in the space between Earth and Zirathi territory. Neither side trusted the other enough to meet on home ground. The station was small, functional, and monitored by sensor arrays from both parties. Any sign of treachery would be met with immediate military response. Admiral Chen led the human delegation, accompanied by diplomats from every major nation on Earth. High Counselor Vethras represented the Zirathi collective, flanked by military commanders and representatives from the 17 member species. The two groups faced each other across a conference table with real-time translators converting speech instantly. The negotiations were tense. The Zirathi wanted guarantees that humans would not use their relativistic weapons against collective territory. The humans wanted a complete withdrawal from their solar system and a non-aggression pact that would last long enough for Earth to rebuild its defenses. Both sides had demands, grievances, and red lines that could not be crossed. Then the news arrived that changed everything. The first of the relativistic projectiles from Project Ragnarok had reached Zirathi space. 3 uninhabited colony worlds, chosen specifically because they had no population but were valuable for resources, were struck simultaneously. The impacts were visible across multiple star systems, releasing more energy than the entire Zirathi nuclear arsenal. The colonies simply ceased to exist. One moment they were solid worlds with mining operations and atmospheric processors. The next moment they were expanding clouds of vaporized rock and metal. The shock waves could be detected across light years. Any ships in the vicinity were destroyed by the debris fields. The Zirathi collective had lost 3 worlds in the span of seconds. High Counselor Vethras watched the recordings with an expression that human analysts struggled to interpret. Was it shock, horror, resignation? Whatever it was, it changed the tone of the negotiations immediately. The Zirathi stopped making demands and started making concessions. They agreed to everything humanity asked for and added provisions that Earth had not even considered. Admiral Chen authorized the transmission of a final message. Humanity had launched 50 more relativistic projectiles before the first impacts. They were currently in transit, targeted at various Zirathi holdings. These projectiles could be diverted or self-destructed if the peace treaty was honored, but if hostilities resumed, they would continue to their targets. And humanity could build more, many more. The Zirathi understood the implications immediately. Even if they destroyed Earth completely, even if they sterilized every human colony and killed every person who knew how to build such weapons, The projectiles already in motion would arrive, and there was no defense against them. At 40% of light speed, sensors would detect them only seconds before impact. No shield could stop them. No weapon could destroy them. The Zirathi could only watch and wait for the inevitable destruction. The peace treaty was signed within 24 hours. The terms were simple and absolute. The Zirathi Collective agreed to a non-aggression pact lasting 1,000 years. They would withdraw all military forces from human-controlled space. They would pay reparations to help Earth rebuild. And most importantly, they would share information about other spacefaring civilizations, giving humanity the knowledge needed to navigate the galactic community. In return, humanity agreed to recall the relativistic projectiles still in transit. They agreed not to expand beyond their solar system for the next century, giving the Zirathi time to adjust to this new reality. And they agreed to establish diplomatic channels that would hopefully prevent any future conflicts. The news of the treaty spread across the galaxy within weeks. Other civilizations that had been conquered by the Zirathi watched with amazement. Some began to quietly ask if the treaties binding them to the collective were still valid. Others started building their own defenses inspired by humanity's example. The balance of power in this sector of space had shifted, and everyone knew it. On Earth, the celebrations were tempered by loss. Cities held memorials for the fallen, families mourned, loved ones who had died defending their world. The global economy struggled to recover from the massive mobilization and conversion to war production. But humanity had survived, and that was enough. Admiral Chen stood before the World Congress giving her final report on the war. She described the battles, the strategies, the costs, and the eventual victory, but her conclusion was not triumphant. Instead, she warned about the future. Humanity had won through desperation and creativity, she explained. They had used every weapon at their disposal, held nothing in reserve, and bet everything on strategies that could have failed at any moment. They had gotten lucky in many ways. The Zirathi had underestimated them. The timing had worked out. The weapons had functioned as designed. But luck was not a strategy that could be relied upon. If humanity wanted to survive in a galaxy full of hostile species, they needed to be stronger. They needed better technology, larger fleets, more advanced weapons. They needed colonies beyond Earth so that no single attack could destroy their species. They needed allies who would stand with them against future threats. And most importantly, they needed to remember the lessons of this war. Years passed. Earth rebuilt. New ships were constructed, incorporating lessons learned from fighting the Zirathi. Colonies were established on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn in the asteroid belt. Humanity spread throughout their solar system, driven by the knowledge that concentration meant vulnerability. The Zirathi kept their distance, honoring the peace treaty. But they watched humanity closely. Reports filtered back to the collective about human expansion, about the new weapons being developed, about the military academies teaching the next generation how to fight. The humans were not resting on their victory. They were preparing for the next war. A young Zirathi student learning about the war in their history classes asked their teacher a question that had been bothering them. If the collective was so powerful, if they had conquered 47 worlds, why had they lost to humanity? The humans were primitives, barely capable of reaching their own moon when the war started. What had made them so dangerous? The teacher, an old veteran who had fought in the war, took a long moment before answering. They explained that humans were not like other species. Most civilizations developed in relative peace, with natural resources and room to expand. They fought occasional wars, but nothing too serious. Nothing that threatened their entire species. Humans were different. They had evolved on a world full of predators, in an environment that constantly tried to kill them. They had competed with each other for resources since before they even understood what war was. They had developed technology not for exploration or trade, but for killing each other more efficiently. Every advance in human civilization was matched by an advance in their ability to wage war. By the time humans developed space travel, they had already perfected the art of destruction. They had weapons that could end their own species. They had strategies that accepted mutual annihilation as a valid outcome. They had a mindset that valued survival above honor, victory above mercy, and revenge above reason. The teacher explained that humanity's greatest weapon was not their technology or their numbers. It was their psychology. They were a species that had been preparing to face extinction since the moment they achieved sentience. They had lived with the threat of nuclear war, climate disaster, asteroid impacts, and pandemics. They had built their entire civilization on the assumption that tomorrow might be the last day. When the Zerathi declared war, they thought they were facing a primitive species that would surrender or die quickly. What they actually faced was a species that had been training for doomsday for thousands of years. Every human weapon, every tactic, every strategy was designed with the possibility of total war in mind. The Zerathi had no answer for that. The student asked one more question. If humans were so dangerous, why did the collective not warn other species? Why allow them to exist? The teacher's answer was simple and chilling. Because trying to destroy humanity would cost more than anyone was willing to pay. The humans had proven that they would take their enemies with them into oblivion. Better to have them as neighbors who honored treaties than as enemies who accepted mutual destruction. On Earth, in a bunker buried beneath the mountains of Switzerland, Admiral Chen walked through corridors lined with sealed doors. Each door was marked with a project name: Achilles, Samson, Armageddon, Pandora, Ragnarok II. Behind these doors were weapons and plans that had been developed during the war but never deployed. Contingency options for scenarios where conventional warfare failed. She stopped at one door, placed her hand on the cold metal, and read the warning label. The contents of this room were classified above top secret. Only 3 people on Earth knew what was behind this door, and only in the most desperate circumstances would it ever be opened. Admiral Chen had retired from active service after the war, but she still held security clearance and occasionally consulted on defense matters. She had come here today to ensure that the weapons were properly